6:07. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out on a Tuesday. We're a little bit late because of that lovely little bit of beautiful weather we had last week, huh? Do we have any additions or deletions to the tonight's agenda? Oh, I called the meeting order.
Did we recognize?
Oh, we didn't. We did. Do we recognize that the meeting is on the unceded ancestral traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nations? Thank you for that. Additions or deletions? Seeing none, any changes in order? Seeing none, I will call for a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Trustee Keller, Trustee McKay. All right, motion to approve the minutes from the January 16th Business Committee meeting, please. Called question. Called question. Sorry, all in favor? Now, motion for the Business Committee minutes. Sure. Trustee McKay, Trustee Stanley. Thank you. All right, we have no. I'll call the question. See, I'm mute. Thank you. We have no presentations tonight, so we will now get into senior staff reports. Superintendent Saywell.
Great, thank you. Through the chair, if you have a look at page 6 in your package, speaks to the local school calendar for 2019-2020 in accordance with the School Act and based upon discussions with the NDTA's Joint Committee. Staff have approved the attached local school calendar dates for the 2019-2020 school year. Staff will make the local calendar available to the public immediately and to report back to the March Business Committee meeting with final recommendations. This will maintain the ministry timeline for calendars to be submitted by March 31st. And on page 7, you can see the calendar.
Thank you.
Take any questions if there are any.
Yes, Trustee McKay.
Because we've had to move our meeting out a little bit of the time frame, do we know?
Yeah, thanks for that. So
thank you.
through the chair.
Just leave it at that.
So because we had challenge last Wednesday and had to cancel our committee meeting, I would propose that we have a special meeting on March the 27th, and that would allot the enough time for consultation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you for catching that, Trustee McKay. Anybody else? All right. Director of Planning and Operations, Sabo, and Transportation Supervisor Prevost are here to now discuss with us our bus route review.
Thank you. Through the chair, tonight staff will present the results of the 18-19 annual bus review and its recommendations. And if you look on starting on page 8 with an information sheet, continuing through to page 26 inclusive, and will form the content of the meeting tonight. The information sheet on page 8, very high level overview, and then Mr. Prevost is going to walk the trustees through the actual route review process in a little bit more detail, speak about the recommendations. The presentation is going to be reasonably high level, and if there's trustees are looking for more detail, Dave is a wealth of information and be able to provide all that he can. So I'll turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Sable. Good evening, everybody. Thank you and for having me out here. And like we said, we'll be going through the annual bus route review for this school year. Let's get right into it. Unless anybody has any preliminary questions.
I just want to know why you, based on the background discussion, an article that we have that nowhere in there is ever had Chiefy involved in these. In ours, it always says that you should have discussions with us prior to making any decisions. And I know this is a low-key one, but this doesn't even include us at all. So when you're actually making changes or wanting to implement changes to the bus routes, our policy states that you should be talking to the people that are affected. So that's for future consideration, because they go about it and they do not and violate our collective agreement on a normal basis. So I'm just pointing that out.
Thank you, Robert. I believe an email was sent through our HR department to you in regards to this several months ago. I'm not sure if that was...
After the fact, but if you even Raymond here, we're never mentioned. That's why I probably we're not mentioned as part of anything. Discussions with background. So I'm just pointing it out.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, we'll carry on, thank you. So the NLPS goal reference we have is organizational effectiveness and accountability to support student learning. So we feel this empowers us to make the changes, or helps empower us to make the changes we need to, again, support student learning and have our organization, meaning our bus routes, very effective. So that's pretty much what we're going on with the NLPS goal. And so the bus route review, all bus routes were reviewed as per AP 512. Those under 50% eligible capacity were reviewed even closer. And our average bus capacity, average registered eligible riders compared to bus capacity. So we generally go 56 secondary students, 84 elementaries, 73 at a combined load, and 81 for one bus we have. Ridership percentages are by route and then by percentage, and percentages representing how full the bus is on any particular trip. So on this one you can see, I'm not sure if you can see on the screen, if you can see in your agenda, the ridership by routes. You can see Route 1 has 0 eligible ridership, and then we go down from there. And the next one is probably a little more usable and interesting, where it goes by percentage. So you can see the bottom, several have 0% eligible ridership. Doesn't mean they have no riders on them. It means those buses are filled close to capacity, or somewhat with uneligible riders, which we call courtesy riders. Any questions in regards to the ridership percentages? Okay, carry on. So in consideration of the recommendations, we look at eligible versus ineligible courtesy, student safety, transportation versus the cost of the transportation assistance, paid out versus the cost of a trip or route, and service levels, and any options available to us, such as RDN transit, safe walk conditions, that sort of thing. Any questions in regards to that?
Actually, I do have a question, if anybody else does. And that was a question I got from a parent about the courtesy and the eligible, ineligible piece and the student safety. When we're looking at a route, I'm thinking particularly of a route like route number 1, I'll use as an example, because it looks like all the riders on route number 1, route number 6, they're all technically ineligible, uneligible riders, and yet we're continuing the route. And I'm guessing that would be because of student safety issues, correct?
Largely. Yes.
Largely. But we're taking them to their catchment schools.
Correct.
So I guess the question was, I think my understanding was when we talked about creating the new policy and the new AP and all this, that part of eligibility criteria was things like student safety, the student safety conditions. So then that we were going to get away from just looking at kilometers, but factor in all of those things. So I guess what they were asking me, and what I'm wondering is it still fair? Is it fair to still call them quote unquote ineligible or courtesy riders when they're going to their catchment school? And it may just be a linguistic thing, but I think what people are concerned about is that they might lose the route.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's always possible. Obviously, we're always looking at effectiveness and organizational effectiveness, and largely for our eligible riders. But we do, with the new AP 512, we do take safety into consideration,
Yeah.
and that's why, if you look in your full package, you'll see the recommendations, and it lists all the other routes that are below 50% capacity there, and it gives reasonings in each individual one why they weren't canceled. Largely, it's due to unsafe walk conditions.
Okay. Yeah.
So yes, no, we're definitely considering, but we have to have some way to define students. Like, we can't just have them all as eligible riders.
Fair.
So we have to have some differentiating factor to be able to know who's courtesy and who's not.
Okay,
It's a
thank
catchy
you.
tune.
Yes, thank you.
Not as catchy as Scott's, of course.
Trustee Barron.
Thank you through the chair. Could you just give a couple or an example or two of what would be considered it says options available, so I'm just wondering if you could give an example of what types of options would be considered on this PowerPoint here, the last section?
Yeah, so options available are obviously, like I mentioned before, is there already in transit there? Like last year, we eliminated Trip 1, Route 1, and they have reasonable walk conditions plus already in transit available to them. So we thought
Okay.
that was sort of a given just about to be able to eliminate that. So we look at all, there's not a lot of options available to us to transport kids or anything to that effect. So we look at any available options, which is walking school buses. Is there transit available? Is it safe walk conditions? That sort of thing. Is there wildlife in there? Is there street walks? How many crossings do they have? Is it 2-lane, 6-lane? Are they controlled crossings? And we look
Looking at
at.
all the variables. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Trustee Keller?
Thanks, through the chair. So throughout the year or year by year when we monitor our bus routes, as if we see that the number of the ridership is declining, do we do anything to inform students within that route that, hey, if you don't start using the bus, this is going to trigger our review?
Generally,
to give them a heads up that, we need to use the bus or you're going to lose it.
Generally not. We will do that through the drivers. I'll talk to a driver and say, your ridership's getting really low. Mention to your kids that if they don't start riding the bus. And that's the same with Z-Pass card use. I have to talk to the drivers regularly to make sure they know how important it is that we get those scans for every student riding our bus. So it's the similar idea where, we generally know we do not give notice though that we're considering elimination. We watch it and generally it's not, we had 1 month of quiet ridership, so we're going to eliminate that route. It's consistent through the school year. I'm always watching the numbers, always considering consolidation, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Anyone else before we continue? All right, I'll let you continue then, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so each trip overview is summarized in the route matrix, and there's comments on the matrix. Reviewed, that means data does not support further review of the bus route. Largely, that will be sufficient eligible riders. Reviewed and no recommendations mean it was reviewed in detail, largely because it's below 50% eligible capacity. And all options are considered, and there's no recommendations proposed, considering that trip or route, meaning elimination or consolidation was another trip. Then the last one is reviewed and recommendation, means the route trip was reviewed in detail and there were recommendations proposed. So, right down to the matrix, and you can see the one that was proposed is in red on that. Very, very difficult to see. I apologize for that because I can't read it from here pretty much, a little bit. But it's all in your package, so if you want to take a look at that, you can see how the routes were summarized, each of the details.
Trustee Stanley?
Can you just explain to me what the checks and the crosses mean?
Yeah, generally the checks are positive, the X's are a negative feature of that review.
So if it's, for example, Route 6 and we're looking at type of road conditions and it has an X, that there's problematic road conditions there? Is that what that means?
Yeah, it'd be walking conditions, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Back to you, sir.
Okay, so the recommendation for 18-19 is we only have 11 registered riders on Trip 1, and we're looking at combining that with Trip 3 of Route 3 as well. So here's a bit of a map. You can see sort of where the bus goes. Again, a little bit difficult to read. You can see Mountain View School in there, and then it goes out beyond there. For NDSS, it would go straight out to Andre Road, stopping at Shady Mile and such, come back through Allsop Road, picking up along the way back into Mountain View School down to NDSS. That's sort of, in a nutshell, the route for NDSS.
Trustee Stanley?
I hope I'm not jumping the gun on your presentation here. But I just want to, given that, I want to follow up on Trustee Keller's question, which is specifically though, when you've got a route that you're making recommendations for, like we have in this situation, how do you reach out, or can you tell us how you've reached out to eligible riders in that area, whether they're riding the bus or not, to inform them of the potential changes? Can you just talk to us about how the NQED is informed about that?
I can do that very easily because we have not done any of that. So we don't reach out and plead with people to ride our bus. They're either going to ride it or they're not. We've had low ridership on that route for several years now. And so generally we do not reach out to families to say, put your student on the bus or we're going to cancel it, because obviously they're not riding for a reason, whether they don't like the times, parents driving them, the students have their own driver's licenses and cars. We don't know, so we just look at our bus scans, who's riding the bus. It's available to them, has been for many years. So.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so impacts. So consolidation versus elimination means that eligible riders are able to return their school bus ride to NDSS and back again. NDSS students are actually positively affected through this, through ride times. We're hoping that may attract back some eligible riders. Mountain View students, which you can see are 81% courtesy, retain a large part of their service. They're affected with increased ride times and earlier morning pickup times. Afternoon times stay about the same. Out of attendance area, service to Mountain View School to be eliminated from the Miners Park subdivision, which is part of a school catchment change several years ago. That area is now in the Fairview catchment. So we gave them probably about 4 years of leeway to either find their own way or start attending Fairview. And that bus, that actual stop is down from about 15 kids down to about 4, so it's come way down. So they have started to find their own way. There is a staffing impact, as Mr. Zavir mentioned earlier, and estimated yearly savings are about $5,000 per year through the consolidation. So consolidation versus elimination. The first thing I thought of, at least me, is we're going to eliminate that trip. You know, Route 3 Trip 1 was going to be eliminated. And I started thinking about it a little further and realized that we could consolidate that trip, continue the service to the NDSS students, and it would just be some effect. So consolidation versus elimination. Consolidation would affect the Mountain View students. Elimination would affect the NDSS students adversely. So. Savings for an elimination of Route 3 Trip 1 would be very small due to the affected students being paid transportation assistance. The savings were actually almost a zero balance. So that was another reason I wanted to look at it a little closer, because if we were going to eliminate something, I'd like to see some financial savings from that. It's not just an elimination of service. NDSS students would be affected by elimination. They'd have limited access to RDN transit bus. And when I say limited access, it means it doesn't stop between Andre Road and Kilpatrick Road. Kilpatrick Road is the first stop it makes, so any students wanting to use that service would have to make their way to Kilpatrick Road. You can see that on the map if you're not sure where it is. Consolidation option sees all in-catchment service for NDSS and Mountain View students remaining, and aligns with the previous school boundary changes I mentioned earlier. So you can see the proposed Route 3 morning schedule. In red is the proposed 2019-20 times, and the current times are in the black beside it. So you can see the different pickup times for all the students. You'll notice that it's sort of jumbled all over because the change affects a large part of Route 3. You couldn't just say this, you know, it's just all Trip 1 and Trip 3 combined. So we had to juggle it around a little bit to make it work.
Okay, I have a question then, just because I want to make sure I understand too, speaking to what Trustee Stanley's sort of following up on that. So the elementary students who are impacted by this change, the ones who are technically now in the Fairview catchment. So if they could get to a stop that went to Mountain View, if their parents could drop them off there at an appropriate time, and we had space in the bus, would we take them to Mountain View?
Of course we would, yes.
Okay,
And there
so
is a stop they can get on at NDSS, so it's only a couple blocks away, really. So
okay, so I just
there
checking.
is an available option.
There's an
to them.
option for those families.
That's one of their options, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll carry on, go to the afternoon time. So there's the afternoon schedule. Pickup times are largely the same. They are affected somewhat, but not in huge ways. So the next steps, information being presented tonight. Information will be released via communications with a link to the presentation and slideshow. We would send information to all the stakeholders affected by this change, parents, students, and schools. And we would adjust the routes and then monitor responses to the bus route changes.
Yes,
May
question?
I ask a question?
Yes.
Through the chair. Okay, so if the board was to approve the change, is there, the students who are currently taking the bus, would those same students still have the ability to take the bus, although at the altered time? If there's capacity for buses and they're still...
Yes, there's sufficient capacity for both NDSS and Mountain students together. They're largely be combined, they'll be combined both morning and afternoon. So, yes.
Follow-up?
Yes, and then
So-
trustee McKay.
So just to confirm then, it's basically a time change, it's not a service level change.
Correct.
And trustee McKay.
Thank you. Through the chair, I just want to point out that we are not approving this.
Right.
This is operational, and this is more of an update information piece to the board. We don't need to pass a motion on this. Thank you.
Through the chair, could you confirm, please, again, the time frame of when parents would be notified of the change before it actually takes place?
So generally, we don't publish too early, because if we do, it gets confused. They think it's for this year, and then they start, sending their kids out to the bus at the wrong time. So generally, we make the changes mid-June. That's when we'll start sending information out to parents and schools and publish the changed routes. So it's generally
Just to clarify, maybe I'll jump in. There was a few things discussed that I'd like to add as well. That I did want to comment about the notification process for parents. So, in fact, our policy's now been in place for 2 years. So this is the second year, and it has the 50% drive. So parents are aware of that, and we've done. This is our second year doing the presentation, so it's available on the internet. Most of our routes, the majority of our routes are below 50%, so if we were to notify people, we'd be notifying them of the policy, but the majority of routes would be put on notice, and not the majority of routes are affected by the outcome. It's only once the route reviews happened and the recommendation comes forward, do we actually have something to present to the trustees. So that's why the notification is in the order that it's in. After this meeting tonight, if there's no other clarifying direction from the board, then staff would notify the stakeholders of the route immediately. So within a week or two, and they would have an opportunity to understand and respond if they had feedback with respect to their route. And so the first time they hear about it isn't in June. The first time they hear about it will be shortly after this meeting. One final comment that was mentioned, Mr. Zavir from QB indicated that staff hadn't followed the Article 11 process, and in fact that was brought to staff's attention last year, that we had done the route review and brought recommendations to the board, and that hadn't considered in QP's consideration, that we hadn't given that due consideration. This year we did send notification to QP through our HR department, and we're available for a response. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I want clarity on it after the fact. They'd already done the work, notified me that I can be involved after they already done it, not while they were doing it. The part is we're supposed to be part of knowing what's going on so that we can speak to the board or the trustees, not giving it and saying it was going to come to your meeting in about 3 minutes and there's your notification. That doesn't work. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Any further questions?
Any further questions? Trustee McKay? No, I thought I saw your hand. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. Barring that,
We're down
we
to
will.
questions.
Pardon?
We're down to questions. No further questions?
No. Yes, trustee.
I do, but it's relates, so basically what I'm wondering, and although it relates to the notification time and school registration time and the school catchment boundaries. So I recognize that considering that we don't, out of catchment school considerations aren't being considered, at least the past year. I'm not sure if that's in place for the next year, or if that's been talked about. But in consideration for times where maybe parents would be interested and are able to go to schools that are outside of their catchments, when is the date that they register for those schools? Because I'm wondering what happens if a parent all of a sudden loses their bus and they really wanted to go to X school, and now that they've lost their bus, that's the final straw for them, and now they want to. So I'm wondering if this notification time, mid-June, gives them enough time to have considerations about school enrollments. That's my only, consideration on that.
Trustee McKay?
We've, out of catchment is March 15th, in catchment applications is June 30th.
Okay. So I think that's something, I mean, I recognize that right now it's not potentially relevant. But I think when we have that possibility, that it's, and I know this may be a small amount, but I'm just aware that if this is a part of parent information informed consent about, or choice about where they want to go to school. And if their busing has a big role in that, because as a parent whose kids take the bus, it's a big factor for me. So I could see that having an influence. And if I had to drive my kid to this school, I might as well drive them to the other, So I'm wondering if that's something that we want to consider for future, is earlier notification to get that out of catchment enrollment when we have out of catchment enrollment as a possibility, which we don't right now. But
Trustee McKay?
I can follow after Mr. Prevost.
Mr. Beaver,
I'm sorry, all I was gonna state was, it's my belief that in that out-of-catchment application, it states in there that responsibility lies on the family to transport their kids to and from that school. I'm not 100% sure, but that's my belief.
yeah, right. I don't think that's quite related to my comment. I'm thinking that if they're going to lose their bus, that might make them consider another school.
Right,
So
right.
they knew they would be driving anyway, so they might as well drive to a different school.
Right.
So
right.
that's what I'm just wanting to make sure that parents have that information.
Certainly, if it's the wish of the board and the district, we could certainly send notification to those few students that are being affected before March.
Thank you, through the chair. I think Trustee Stanley's comments are, what's the right word? It poses an interesting question. But I think at this time, we're, as a district, in a position where I'm not sure that there's a lot of options for out-of-catchment opportunities. So it kind of, perhaps it's a question for the future.
All right, seeing nothing further, thank you for your report.
Thank you all very much.
All right. All right. And the next item on our agenda is
Just invite
Tanya with our amended budget. Tonight? Or are we doing it?
No, not tonight. Okay. It's just on.
What page are you starting? What are we on? The first page is going to be 50 of 131. Okay. Something is so far? Yeah. So tonight, here to present the amended annual budget. And I have tried to present this in the same manner that the ministry document is put together, which is why I've alluded to it starts at the back. The information is rolled up into the bylaw that will be presented and approved by you. So The ministry document is here, but I'd like to follow the presentation, so I'm on page 27 of 131. And just opening for just the purpose of this is to provide you with updated budget from the annual to the amended, some actuals, and that we're going to follow the presentation as per the ministry document. So on page 28 of 131, we're discussing Schedule 4 of the ministry document, which is the capital revenue and expenditures. Presented on this schedule are the revenues the capital revenues that we will recognize for use in this fiscal year. From the annual budget, we have increased those to adjust for what we will recognize this year from what we assumed we would earlier. So this is a more actual figure. We have increased our investment income. On the expenses side, we have increased the amortization of our tangible capital assets. Important to note that the revenue is an annual amount. The amortization of the assets is all of the assets that we have district-wide over the course of X amount of years and their useful life. We've just added or increased Frank J. Nay with an addition there, as well as Hammond Bay Gym. We have also purchased increased technology from the annual budget. So we've updated our amortization accordingly. So the difference between the revenue and the expenditures is a deficit of $2.8 million. We then bring in the transfer from operating to local capital to support our technology plan, our capital leases, and the local capital funds that will enable us to take on projects outside of what is funded by the ministry. So ministry approves X amount of projects a year, hopefully, per our capital plan. Any of the projects that are required out in the schools, infrastructure, new classrooms due to class size and composition, things like that must be funded out of our local capital. So very important that we have local capital in order to do these projects. So the surplus in the capital fund is the $1.5 million, which is the only surplus, budgeted surplus, that you will see in the amended budget. On page 29 of 131, we roll from
sorry to interrupt. Trustee O'Neill is away tonight, but is trying to attend via phone, and so she might be jumping in with a question, might have a question at some point. So we got her back. We've got her back. All right, we've got her back, so we'll just have to try to keep track. And
okay, stop me if necessary. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So from capital, we move on to special purpose. Our special purpose revenue and expense summary is showing you the increased revenues that we are realizing from the time of the annual budget. Predominantly, our initial classroom enhancement ask to the ministry was X amount of FTE and so forth. When we realized what our enrollment figures were and the increased divisions that we were needing, we had a subsequent ask, and that was then approved, which is why the 1.13 million additional funds coming in since the annual budget. The other items are what was left over in the special purpose funds at the end of last year that are deferred into this year for use. Whether or not there are balances, those are realized June 30th on the financial statements and then added into the budget. So when we create the annual budget, which we're going to be going into shortly for the next year, we don't have that information, of course. Once the financials are all accounted for at the end of the school year, if there are balances and they are allowed to be moved forward into those particular special purpose funds, we add that money in and they're then presented in the amended budget. The expenses, allocated accordingly. However, the only issue that, not necessarily issue, but the important thing to note here is that our substitute cost is extraordinarily low, which is a difficulty with our failure to fill, especially when we're dealing with specialized positions that we see more of in the special purpose funds. So, however, there will be no surplus at the end that is able to be used. It goes back into the special purpose funds for next year. So, again, we're monitoring that, but overall 47% spent to date.
Trustee Barron and then Trustee Stanley.
Just through the chair, just for comparison, do we know how much it was at this time last year?
I don't, and I'm sorry, I wanted to give that information. However, there's it's a new budget document. I wasn't sure how much to kind of pile on in one evening. That's definitely something that I can and will bring to the next quarterly report.
Thank you.
Trustee Stanley?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you wanted to save questions till the end or not.
No.
Okay.
Whatever works.
So, under expenses, looking at the administrative officers, how come, can you explain to me why I've got 124 spent, and that's,
I can
explain that. I don't know if they have the same, like, it's not, yeah, are they 50% on the same schedule as teachers? Can you
Easy
give
to
the
explain.
background?
In the original budget, this actually had to do with the classroom enhancement fund. In the original budget, you can see that we budgeted for $246,000 under the administrative officers. However, we subsequently reduced the administrative officers in the classroom enhancement fund by 1.0 FTE and realigned to different needs, mostly custodial and so forth. So halfway through the year, we had accrued those costs, then we reduced the budget. So of course, it's making it look quite skewed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just looking at the substitute part of it, where it says there's only 219,000 actual, and there's $1.2 million in there.
At 18% spent, yeah.
Yeah, now, that would be if it rolled out, that leaves a fair amount of money to be sitting in that account. It's just a cautionary factor that some of these numbers will turn out to be, at the end of the day, larger amounts than were anticipated for the surplus.
So this doesn't roll into the surplus because this is special purpose, not operating. So how this will play out is whatever is budgeted for substitutes in each one of the special purpose funds and whatever was expended in that special purpose fund. If the special purpose fund is 12 million, whatever their balance left over at the end of the year becomes their deferred revenue next year. It's not transferable into operating. It has no bearing on our.
I know where it goes. It's still surplus.
In these special purpose funds, yes. Yes.
Trustee Barron? Trustee Hill?
Before I forget, sorry, I didn't realize we were not holding questions to the end. Back on page 28, budget surplus for the year, 1.5 million roughly. On page 28.
Okay, you're on 28, yes.
Yeah. Is this amount consistent with our surplus policy?
So sorry, budgeted surplus is 1.5 million.
Right.
So our surplus policy, again, is our operating funds.
That's not capital.
This is our capital fund.
Okay.
Okay?
And can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Do we have projects identified in our capital plan that these funds are earmarked?
Absolutely, and I would actually, as we move through, I will allude to another schedule that actually shows the opening local capital balance, the transfer in. I think Secretary Treasurer and I were discussing that we would bring a local capital summary at another meeting, as it is fairly in-depth again, to put on top of this. But yes, absolutely. We look at it from the perspective of a long-range facilities plan. So we have projects that we are currently engaged in, projects that we will be engaged in over the next few months, next year, next couple of years, that we see as our infrastructures are aging, where we're going to need those upgrades, as well as where we're potentially needing portables due to our class size and composition, and where we might reserve funds in order to deal with that so that we're not in a situation where we've got no room for children at schools. Okay, so on page 30, of 131. So this would be our operating revenue and expense. The changes that have been made to date are mostly due to our annual budget. We did an estimated enrollment count for 14,145 student FTE. Our actual student FTE turned out 14,297, so it was an increase of 152 FTE. That plus a $31,000 mental health grant is the 1.9 additional MOE grant revenue. We had a $30,000 increase in our other provincial, which is our Industry Training Authority grant. We decreased our ISE tuition, as I alluded to the possibility when I presented last, that we didn't have the student numbers quite that we originally assumed that we would, so we lowered that ISE budget accordingly. As well, the rentals and leases and investment income we needed to increase, as what we were actually receiving was less than what we had budgeted, so we increased that. Our expenditures are aligned, other than, again, our substitutes. We are dealing with a failure to fill, so there's a 35% actual there, important to note. So our overall expenses, our revenue and expenses for the amended budget show a deficit of $219,883. We then bring in the allocation of restricted surplus, and then we make the transfer out to local capital, presenting a balanced budget. Actuals show to date that there is a $1.8 million potential surplus. I stress potential, as we are only in February. And one thing that's important to note is schools are allocated out resources in the beginning of the year, and predominantly are cautious in their spending until the latter portion of the year, as they don't necessarily know what resources they want to bring into the school. They don't know if there's going to be anything they need to account for, so they generally try to do most of their spending in the end of the year for anything that they want to bring into the school. So we'll see a bigger supplies and services increase at the end of the year, which could affect that total. As well, again, local capital is something that we're really concerned about making sure we have enough for, as we're looking at increased enrollment over the next few years, and needing to bring in more classrooms, and ministry is not funding those portables. So having some sort of surplus that we can transfer to local capital is definitely something that we're hoping. And I see questions.
We're just waiting. No, just finish your thought.
Okay. So just saying this is a very preliminary estimate.
And then we have a question from our Deepak.
Through the chair, so with the substitutes and failure to fill, so what happens? So I guess we need a teacher sick, we need a sub, we don't have subs to fill, so do admin staff end up going to those classrooms? That's a huge failure to fill number, and I know that, so what does that mean in our classrooms in terms of how those teachers are getting the backfill?
So I can't answer to what happens in the classroom because I'm not in the classroom,
Okay.
and I'm not an administrator, so I don't know. I can say that yes, this is a concern.
Right.
As far as how that's operationalized out there, I would try to defer to somebody else.
Mr. Davey, can we call on you to speak to this?
Sure, through the chair. As is noted, we do have a number of situations where we have failure to fill in the classroom. What I can say is that we always have a situation where we are filling a classroom absence with a qualified teacher. That may be a situation where we are having to pull a non-enrolling teacher from their assignment to place into the classroom, working directly with students. We also have at the secondary level situations where we may be pulling a teacher from a prep block, or having a teacher who may not be on a full-time assignment within a school and assigning them to a particular block to cover that classroom as well. So as is noted, it is a concern, but it is also a reality, and something that I would say provincially, we're facing a shortage of teachers, so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, through the chair. So, not being an accountant, I spent a lot of time reading through this, trying to understand the language. And I guess it's under Schedule 2C, 2B, 2A2, Operating Revenue and Expenses on page 4. The fourth paragraph down. Total operating expenses exceed total operating revenues, leaving a deficit of $219,883. The budget is then balanced by adding the restricted surplus allocation prior to the transfer of funds between operating and local capital. Can you please put that in layman's terms so I can understand that?
So, X amount of dollars in from ministry, from other provincial sources. We then make decisions such as we want to maintain community school coordinators, which was a 4 FTE, which we didn't have in the budget. That was brought in from a restricted surplus. So we have the revenues, what our expenses were, so our staffing expenses, our supplies expenses, the initiatives that we put in the budget and were approved, were then changed to make some room for community school coordinators and such, which put us in a deficit situation. So then we take restricted surplus, we balance the budget up to cover that for the year, which is not sustainable, but that's what we did. Then we've taken any of the leftover balance, which we did so cognizantly because we wanted to transfer over to local capital in order to cover our loans, our leases, our technology, and the projects that we're lining up to go forward. So we need to show the revenues and the expenditures before those transfers as ministry requires and before the appropriation of the surplus that we're putting into the budget.
That's a follow-up, okay? Yes. So just to follow up so I understand. So basically we used restricted funding that we had in our possession to fund ongoing operating expenses.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you to the chair. It's not only when you see the substitute 35% for awareness, it's not only in the teaching side.
Thank
you. EAs are going without. We don't have necessary replacements for a lot of support staff. It's bad in pretty well most school districts. So cautionary, they say there will be probably additional funds there. And if I could do a follow-up, my other one is how much local capital was taken from operations at the beginning of the year that wasn't budgeted at last year's? Was there additional money put in, or was it the amount that was supposed to be from last year transferred into it?
So we don't make any transfers without board approval, and the list that was provided to the board and was approved is what was transferred. So there was nothing more transferred other than
last year. There was 4.5 on the list because I didn't see the 4.5 on last year, so I'm just asking the question.
So sorry, the question being?
It says 4.5 million was transferred to local capital.
This year?
This year.
Yeah.
And what I asked is, was that the amount that was budgeted in last year's? When they did the costing, there's always money that's supposed to be allocated for local. Was that the amount? Because I think it doesn't matter, I'm just asking the question.
Still not 100% following your question. However, we budgeted for a particular amount of local capital transfer. That generally is for our technology plan.
But what I'm saying, did they equal or was it amended?
This is the amended amount. In the annual budget, the amount that we did was, it's right, so Rob, on page 14 of the budget document, when you're looking at the actual schedule 4 on the budget document, can you show me the page number on that? Sorry, it's page 50 of 131.
This is page 42.
That's one. Page 50 of 1. So if you look where the 4335 is, and then you look over the 2019 annual budget, the amount was 1801. That was what was in the original budget.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes, so everything since then has been presented and approved and no, but I'm just saying, so we added per, some of the actual items that were restricted surplus had to go into local capital because they're of a capital nature. So some of those items had to go into local capital, as well as the money that we asked for to be transferred over to support ongoing projects. So yes, it was increased.
Thank you. Mr. Barron, do you have a question? Yes, through the chair. If you could just help me out with this. I'm trying to, so on page 29.
We're in special purpose?
Under special purpose.
Okay.
You spoke to the Classroom Enhancement Fund, where
Yep.
there was a grant. Is that right? Correct?
It's, fund grant.
Fund, okay. That was provided to provide funding with the class size composition, the changes to the classrooms required to be able to
Adhere to
accommodate
language,
that. And then there was additional funding that was provided, which is that adjustment there. And you said that the ministry will not be providing any additional funding for portables. And so I'm just trying to figure out that Classroom Enhancement Fund, because I don't know, did that include any portable funding? Are portables a separate entity in themselves?
Ministry funded for year one capital only in year one. After the first year was exhausted, they assumed that we got ourselves up to a space standard that then we could take going forward. So since then, this year, any of the portables that we've needed to add have been of our own funding, hence the local capital. So year one, they provided us with X amount of portables, X amount of capital funding to support that. Ongoing, there is no capital funding whatsoever from ministry to support the Classroom Enhancement Fund LOU. So this 12 million, the original 11.1 million was our original ask to the ministry. And once our enrollment settled and we knew what that was and what that looked like and where we had divisions that were due to composition, we submitted to the ministry for an increased funding. Where they were due to operations, that was our cost. So then we submitted that to the ministry and they included our remedy, and that's the increase in funding, so no capital.
Okay.
And just for clarity's sakes, if it was capital, it would not be presented on the operating statement here. It would have been in capital, and that would have been part of the revenue that we were going to recognize over the course of this year, which includes like our AFG capital and the big capital projects that ministry approves. If they were giving us any capital money for portables, it would be in there as well.
What does AFG stand for?
Sorry, annual facilities grant.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
A lot of assumptions that everyone knows. Yeah, my apologies.
Thank you. Through the chair, do you recall in October there was a motion by the board to transfer to local capital for portables? Do you recall the amount of that?
I believe it was 1.2 million. I believe it was 2 million.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, which we have benchmarked for that purpose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not 100% sure. I think we left off on the operating 1.8. Had I moved to, I'm sorry, bottom?
Bless you.
Okay. Yes, so failure to fill, and Rob, thank you. I was actually going to round back out to that. It does also include EAs, not just teaching. So that's, yes, our failure to fill scenario. Okay, so on page 31 of 131, and this is 41 of 131 for you, apologies.
Okay.
So this is a schedule of our change in accumulated surplus, and these figures are from our financials, so they are actually not presented in the annual budget, because at the time that we create the annual budget in March, of course, these numbers aren't known. So now they are within our amended budget so that they can be presented on our financial statements for submission to ministry. So our opening surplus balances and the operating and the capital fund are presented. The two adjustments to those funds, the 219,000 in the operating, the 2.8 million in the capital, and then the transfer from operating to capital leaves the ending balances. And important to note, because it will be sitting on the bylaw, that the operating fund, 219,000, and the capital fund deficit, 2.8 million, give us the 3 million that will be presented in the bylaw, because that is all funds rolled up together. Statement 4, I'm not even going to discuss. It's for the financial statements only. It has no bearing on this budget. The budget bylaw found on page 32 of 131. So again, this takes the capital, the operating, and the special purpose, consolidates them all up into total revenue, less our total expenses, leaving us with a $3 million deficit, which then our allocation of restricted surplus is added, leaving us the deficit, or the surplus of 1.5 million, which is what was the capital surplus. The actual bylaw amount is expenses only, rolled up into 163,413,778. So on page 33 of 131, I have provided a chart of the FTE changes from the annual budget to the amended budget. Teachers equates to the divisions that we needed to add. EAs, the designations over the annual budget, or over what we assumed we were going to have in the annual budget. Our support staff of 9.3, we recently brought some information about adding 3 FTE to facilities, 2 FTE to information technology. Over the course of this year so far, we have added 2.7 of clerical support, 1.56 caretaker support, and a little 0.063 bus route to support the new Woodland site. And I've also given you the breakdown of what's in the special purpose FTE compared to the operating FTE, so that you can see the difference there. Questions on that?
Questions from Ms. Wood? Thank you, through the chair. So this is what's budgeted, but how many of these positions are not filled yet?
Would have to provide that information in a separate.
Any other questions? Trustee? Okay.
I want to ask one after the motions, because it's not related to the motions, but it's related to this conversation.
Okay. Okay, so do you have anything further? Anything further, Ms. Sutton? Okay, so at this point then we have on page 27, there are 2 recommendations which need to be moved and seconded. So if we could have one of our trustees move these, Trustee Keller? Would you please, for the record?
Do you like both of them at the same time?
Yeah, we can do it as one. Yeah, it's one recommendation, actually.
Okay, so that the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, give all 3 readings of the 2018-2019 amended annual budget bylaw during the February 27th, 2019 open board meeting, and that the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, adopt the 2018-2019 amended annual budget bylaw during the February 27th, 2019 open board meeting.
Seconded by Trustee McKay. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried unanimously. All right, thank you very much. Now, Trustee Stanley, you had a comment or question?
2 comments. One, I wish Stephanie was here. I don't know if you're listening, Stephanie, wherever you are. But I believe the BCSD has already done a motion about school districts having to pay for portables, which should be covered in capital costs, because frankly, this classroom is ridiculous. So I think that's something that the board should consider bringing forward to the AGM, but however, I think we need to do some research about, I think it's been done. So let's look at the previous motions that have been passed and then see if there's something that we can either add to that or just, request follow-up on.
Okay.
Just because I think that's some advocacy that the boards need to be doing. As well, with regards to the failure to fill, I just want to, and it's not relevant to the budget. I mean, it's an impact of it. I am concerned about the mental health impacts on our staff in these failure to fill situations. We are having to make do with less, and that is really being borne on the backs of our staff, and that is a really high stress, challenging, forever feeling like you're underwater situation. So I guess I want to say is that given that this is just, as I think Deputy Superintendent said it well, this is a reality that we're in. Yeah. And it's an unfortunate situation that has had many contributors, but let's face the reality and let's, I would suggest that we perhaps look at some ways to, whether it's maybe perhaps if we have a surplus, how is it that we can perhaps look at or consider some of the stress impacts on our staff from this unfortunate reality. I just kind of want to, for the future, put that out there because I do think that's a really unfortunate situation.
Yeah. And does anyone else have any comments? Because I'd like to sort of follow up on that. I would agree with you, and I would also add that, like this morning I was at a school, and actually no, it's not a fair example because they actually do have stuff. But I've been in situations where, where I've talked to teachers where I've seen it's a ripple effect because it adds stress on the classroom. It adds stress on students when if they don't get some of their learning assistance time. It adds stress on the SST teachers who are in classrooms and are feeling badly about the kids that they're not getting to see. It's principals who are being pulled out of admin time when they, and so students that they could be dealing with. So it is absolutely a huge issue, and it's absolutely something that we need to continue to talk about and to try to figure out how we can support all of our staff around this one. Trustee Barron?
Yes, through the chair.
Okay.
I think we can all agree that it's
an
issue that we're having in our schools. I'm just wondering if we'll be receiving some sort of a report or on the progress that's happening in our schools to recruit and retain staff and through this process that we're going through right now. Is there any measures or is there going to be some sort of...
We can certainly request that kind of a report. Ms. McVeigh, and then I see Mr. Zver, but I'll just let...
I just thought I would help with that. So normally during the annual budget process, each department will report out on how, the previous year has gone and what they're looking forward to for the next budget year, and HR would normally include that sort of thing.
Okay. Mr. Zver.
I don't know if it's the right time to ask or not, but basically, do you have an idea how much was saved during the school snow closures?
That's not something that we've calculated.
Yeah. Anybody?
No idea.
I just said that's not something that we've calculated.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Okay, so moving on from, sorry. I'm not sure what's happening. It's cold. What's happening? What are we doing here? Okay. Oh, we are doing more budgets. Oh, okay.
Just doing the ministry enrollment projection.
Right, thank you.
And then briefly, we need to comment that the budget calendar's in the packet.
Gotcha, I missed it.
Yeah, it almost doesn't,
Yeah.
they're all in the same agenda.
Okay, sorry, I do apologize. The ministry document is
Extremely hard to read. My apologies. So the information sheet here is being provided to you to give you some relevance to the requirement for the district to submit a 3-year enrollment projection.
The enrollment projection for our upcoming year will be the base of our annual budget. So we will receive that. We've submitted this as of February 15th. And in mid-March, we will receive our confirmation of our operating grant from the ministry. And this information is what drives that. So we are very careful about how we project and submit this information to the ministry so that we don't find ourselves in a position of overfunding. So we use a software solution organization called Baragar Solutions. They support many of the districts in the province. They are sort of the key provider. However, they are a tool that we use, and we also use our historic trends. We use any local knowledge that we may have. Not to say we're driving around to different areas in town, noticing buildings and so forth, because they might not net school-aged children for us. So if you start to look at that and you start to think that you see a 5-story or 15-story high-rise or a huge subdivision going in, and you think, okay, let's put our local knowledge in there. Let's assume that we're going to get, 2.2 kids every house. And if we use that and we put that into our projection and those children don't show up at our schools, ministry has given us $130 million, maybe we actually only are due $125 million, and we're $5 million in a very bad situation. So it's a very cautious approach. Again, mostly using Baragar and our historical trends. Also looking at wanting to go in a conservative way. So if Baragar says we're going to be 215 head count higher, okay, that's great information. We see some historic trends that tell us that we are growing. However, if they don't show up, so then we're careful and say maybe we'll find a happy medium in there. And then once we get our count on September 30th, so we build our budget with that initial enrollment projection. September 30th, we get the recalc that actually counts the whites of the students' eyes into FTE, and that is what drives the changes that I just actually presented to you in the amended budget. So what I'm presenting to you here is that we have said to ministry that we will see an increase in 85 FTE in this coming school year, which will be again recalculated on September 30th due to our data collection, and any changes to that will then be given to us mid-December. So wanting to keep it very high level and just opening it for questions. Okay.
Mr. Thank you, the chair. So just a question. I recognize that there's definitely some value in taking a conservative approach, because it's probably better to be in a position of maybe not having enough funding and having to claw back. However, it seems to me like the approach that is being used is you're always going to be reactionary to changes in our community, because we're strictly sort of basing our decisions and our projections based on what's happened in the past and not what we're projecting out into the future. And I'm wondering why we haven't, or why couldn't we, what would be the barriers to us actually factoring in, like you said, the local knowledge, but this is not just driving around the community, this is working with our municipal partners to get development data and base it, at least in some fashion, in what we're actually seeing on the ground. Number of lots, number of built units, these are real statistics that are available potentially if we work together, and that could provide a fairly accurate determination of what's actually happening in the community. And like you said, we realize that, yes, you can't necessarily equate units to students, but it's probably going to add value to what we're already doing. And I guess secondly to that is how this fits in with our projections and our facilities needs, because these two things should kind of, in my mind, line up. I'm wondering if there's a comment or anything you might add. to that.
Did you want to, or, sorry, did you want to speak to that first?
The only thing I would say is that, you're right, City of Nanaimo Regional District, there are multiple sources of information out there that we can draw from. However, historically, we've been in a situation where we have projected more than the information that we were given from the base providers that we use. One of the pitfalls is city may not actually engage. They may say we have this planned, this planned, this planned. However, the timeline of that, when that's actually going to occur, when they're actually going to start that build, finish that build, sell it, have families move in, and what that actually nets for us. Again, it's a cautious line, and we have been in a situation in the past where we have not been overly cautious, and we've been in an overfunding situation, and it's easier for us to say we're not being reactive, we're being fiscally responsible for the district, and being able to say we can allocate knowing that we're going to get this funding out to staffing and so forth. But if we staff our schools and put the resources out there and the students don't show up, we can't pull that back, and we find ourselves in a very bad situation. So at least we can control when we see the whites of the eyes, which we do. We start to monitor enrollment. As soon as we get our funding, we start to monitor with our central registration what we're actually seeing and where we may need to add classrooms. We do that over the course of 5 months, 6 months, until we see the settle in October. And yes, it absolutely is tied to our facilities plan. The difference with this is FTE. It is not head count. Head count is a body in a chair. Our funded enrollment, if you've got a secondary student out there who's only taking 4 courses, it's 0.125 times 4 courses. It's not 1.0 FTE. On the flip side, you could have a secondary student taking more than 1.0 FTE. So head count different than what our funded enrollment is. But we align them absolutely as we are long-range facility planning and portable planning, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, interest.
Yeah, thanks through the chair. It's, yeah, you know, the last couple of decades, Nanaimo has grown a great deal, and yet our student population declined over that period. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in Alberta or other places where people come back. We were a retirement haven for a long time. But having said that, so it's hard, I'm just suggesting it's hard to predict, but we also have the director of city planning coming next Wednesday to do a presentation on their official community plan as well to help us.
Excellent. Trustee McKay and then Trustee Stanley.
Thank you. Tanya's answered my thoughts. Thank you for that.
Trustee Stanley?
Yeah, so I recognize that this is a very fine balance, and I do have respect for that, having been through a year where we overpredicted students and had to fund classrooms, and that hurt. So I understand that. However, I am going to say, and did you say that we're predicting 85 students increase next year?
Again, not students.
FTE?
FTE.
But did we, so this is what, and am I correct in that we had an increase of 152 FTE this year?
Yes, and so what we're seeing is that there was a spike in the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
We're being told through all the data crunching out there that next year is not going to net quite as much, still an increase, but 211 compared to 2020, 21, and 21, 22 are looking at about a 325 headcount increase, 297 headcount increase, so it fluctuates. But it's also important to note that when the data is then crunched again next year, migration trends, people moving in, people moving out, everything like that, it could change again. So we watch it annually to see how it's moving, shifting, and changing. Last year we were predicted to be a little bit higher this coming year. This year we're actually not meeting that, so we had to adjust accordingly. And I mean this year coming up. So again, when you're dealing with birth rates and the number of women in a particular age group in a particular area, and some statistics from Stats Canada, child tax credit comes into play. All of these factors are used by Beauregard, puts it into a calculation that spits out these projections. Predominantly, they're very, very close. But again, they give us head count. Elementary, that's fine. Secondary, there's some conversions there to make sure that we're not over accounting. So, you know, we do want to be careful. And again, with elementary, for sure, we're watching that, what the kindergarten is from the get-go, right? Because we assume this is going to be the number, but we're consistently watching that central registration to see where we're at, and then allocating divisions where they might be needed accordingly, in line with the classrooms and class size and composition language.
Okay. Anyone else have anything they want to say before I say it? I'm sorry, Trustee McKay. Thank you.
I think it's important that the board recognizes how difficult projections are. Nobody has a crystal ball, so it is virtually impossible, regardless of Beauregard housing stats, birth rates. We can't predict who's going to go to school where, and I recognize that it's difficult in September when, you know, we're off a bit. This year was unprecedented, the number of kids that walked through our front doors that we weren't expecting. And I just want to recognize, A, that that's very difficult for our staff to react, because they're forced into a situation where they react to try to do best and expand classrooms where we need them. But there's zero way for our board to expect staff to come up with the exact right number for us. If you guys could hit a number on the dot, then we should buy a lottery ticket that day, because it's just that difficult. So I just want the board to recognize how difficult that is. You know, they're projections for a reason.
Trustee Robinson.
Just following up on that, with the great difficulty, to comment on the incredible job that Mr. Prevost did staying. I said to Trustee Wilkinson, that's the 8th one of these I've seen. I've seen all kinds of questions about busing. I've never once seen it necessary to change anything that Dave Prevost has come up with. And Tanya presents these things that even I can pretty much understand it. So the challenge is huge, but we have got such incredible staff here staying on top of it. I think that deserves mentioning.
Absolutely. Trustee Barron, and then I'm going to say something.
Yes, through the chair. I agree, it's challenging. I think I want to piggyback a little bit on what Trustee Keller is saying, that I do think it's important for us to be continuously, which we are, I recognize, evaluating and reevaluating how we're accumulating our data, ensuring that we're reaching out to our partners. And, you know, I'm looking forward to the presentation from the city coming up. I think these are all additions to the great work that's happening. So I recognize that that's also important for us to be open to those opportunities. It's better to have too much information than not enough.
Yeah, and I was just going to echo that and say that I have tremendous respect for the work that everybody does with this. This is it is tough. And there's some things we will never be able to predict. I mean, you don't know that, who knew that Fort McMurray, for example, was going to have a fire that was going to, that basically wiped it out, which resulted in people moving back, you know. So there are some things that will always be out of our control. Whether it's Fort McMurray, whether it's things going on in the States, and Canadians I know who who took jobs in the States who are now thinking of moving back because of the political climate in the United States, refugees from other countries. Some of those things are out of our control. All we can do is be aware of them and kind of have in the back of our mind, I wonder, the possibility that we might be impacted by those sorts of world events. But we can't put a number to them. We just have to remain aware of them. And I think we do a good job, and I would echo what my colleagues have said, that I think all we're asking is, and we're seeing that we're doing that, is that we continue to maintain those relationships with those partner groups like the city, so we have presentations like that, so that we can, as Trustee Barron said, get information from as many sources as possible when we make our decisions, rather than 100% relying on only one tool. That certainly Beargar is our most concrete tool, and it should be our primary basis. And in the back of our minds, we have discussions and thoughts around our environment and things that we see happening.
Echoing everything that's been said, and also as a parent with friends who have young children who were significantly impacted by the startup this past September. I agree that having a conservative approach is important. We don't want to get into an over situation. I also think we need to be aware of the potential unintended consequences of being too conservative in our projections, so that when September hits, if we're too conservative, like I think we had the perfect storm this September, right? We were conservative and we had way more than we normally would expect. I just think it's also important that we keep that in mind, that if we're too conservative, the impact on the staff and the students from that period from September until December, when the numbers get adjusted and we have the funds to do what we need to do, it impacted a lot of kids, as all of you know, and so I just want us to also keep that in mind.
To your point, I mean, this last year really was unusual and unprecedented, but just to reassure everybody in the room, even though our budget projections are conservative, the ministry also asks us to update them. Is it in June? I can't remember. So we have a chance to update these again. And then in addition to that, we actually do start staffing even after the budget has been approved. So if we know through central registration, you know, looking at Tim and Tanya and others are constantly monitoring. So last year we added how many divisions before, over and above our budget before September? I'm trying to remember, was it? Six, yeah.
10, but I think before
Yeah.
September
So
6th.
we had already added
Okay.
6, we had to add another 4, I think, closer to September. So we are constantly, even though these are what go to the ministry and that's what our funding's based on, we're making sure that divisions are staffed.
Okay, thank you. And that is, I'm glad you said that, because I think it's important for the public to hear that.
Yeah, that's not something that we
add?
cannot wait on, so we're constantly ensuring that we're tracking it.
If I could add to that also, there's the facility side of that as well. So not only are we looking at, you know, the potential for more staffing, we're looking at the potential for new divisions that may not be existing in schools, which is why we're very, very cognizant of our local capital balances and putting money away so that we can react to those. If we react prematurely, then we have an asset that we're not utilizing, that we can't sell, nobody else wants, what are we doing with it? So again, it's a very fine line in, do we run out and say to ourselves, we think we're gonna see this many kids show up, we're gonna need X amount of classrooms, they don't do that. Not only have we staffed, we've purchased portables, we've done the moving of them, the facility support of them, and the kids don't show up, and that's a double effect.
Absolutely.
So, again, the management of that is a balance.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on this topic? Okay.
The only other thing under item 8.3 is a revised budget calendar, which is
Yes, I
on
was just
page
gonna go there.
51. And so, again, it's still in draft, so it's subject to change, but at the last meeting, we heard people express a bit of concern that not all the meetings were listed in the same manner as they have been in previous years, so those have been included. If anybody sees anything that they think needs to be added, just let us know and we'll update it as we go along.
I just have one question for myself, if nobody else does. Has an invitation been extended to DPAC to make a presentation on the budget? I imagine that's an ongoing.
Yes, we're working out the date.
Schedules.
Okay, thank you. All right, so seeing nothing further there, we don't need any motions on that. That was informational. So our next item on our agenda, we have no correspondence referred. We have no unfinished business. New business, Trustee Stanley, I'm going to go to you first. Around the funding formula review.
Okay. Alrighty. Sorry. So, my main points, or at least what I intend to talk about, would be to provide information about what happened at Provincial Council for PCSDA, not only with our presentation from the Assistant Deputy Minister, but also from the Council's conversation in reviewing the recommendations. And as well, what I want us to be thinking about, and I'll talk about this after I update the board and everyone at present, about that meeting and what occurred, how, you know, what next steps do we want to take in figuring out what kind of feedback that we want to give in response to the recommendations, and although some of that information is yet to come. So please feel free to ask any questions. I think that it's important to hear from what, so Reg Bawa, the Assistant Deputy Minister from the Ministry of Education, he's the resources guy. He presented to us about, he reviewed the current model, he discussed the funding review process, and I'm not going to repeat that because we know that, but he did briefly discuss the recommendations and outlined some of the upcoming process. That new information part was very little. Disappointingly little. He did, however, take questions, and I think it was important for me to see and be able to communicate what were the patterns that I saw of the other school districts and the type of concerns or questions that they had. So I'll talk a bit about that. Overall, you know, one of the dominant concerns is that the school districts are worried about losing money, right? So that is a primary worry across the board, but that's not surprising. The other one is that in a variety of different ways, multiple people spoke out about the lack of specificity in the recommendation report. So there were a number of ways that was asked, but fundamentally it's too vague for school districts to be able to provide, or at least that's the concern, you know, adequate feedback, right? Because we don't really know what a variety of things mean, and I'll get into that a little bit more detail. But that was communicated to the minister, deputy minister, sorry, assistant deputy minister. So school districts requested more definitions, more specifics. They requested models. They requested examples to allow for a better understanding of what these recommendations would look like, particularly with regards to number 6. Number 6 is definitely the hot recommendation. There's a few others. It was quite clear that, first he said, Reg said that Mr. Bawa said that the feedback, the specifics aren't known right now, and that the feedback that they get back during this process will determine the specifics. So a model is not known. Trustees indicated then back to them that we can't provide information if we don't have specifics. So that's a real challenge that we need to address, I would suggest. That being said, I don't see that more specifics will be coming forward. So I think that that's just a reality. There may be some conversations that are upcoming that there might be some information relayed, but we'll have to kind of pay attention to that. In that regards, I suggest that we consider multiple interpretations or scenarios when evaluating recommendations of concern. Right? Not all recommendations are going to be things that we need to go through in detail. A lot of them are fairly straightforward. Regarding number 6, however, Mr. Bawa communicated that assessments will still occur. So this is definitely a question that I asked, but that they will not be necessary to ensure funding. However, later he said something that made me a bit concerned. He implied that the term assessment can be interpreted widely. And it might mean that they're just going to be doing scans instead of full psychoed assessments. And so that's something that I think we really need to clarify is how is the assessment, what role will assessment play in determining kids' needs? Yes, it's going to be separated from funding, but what is that going to look like? So there was concern that children's needs will not be fully understood if not accurately assessed. So, for example, you know, we can do scans for reading challenges, and I know we do that in our school district, but those information, they don't give us information about processing speed or working memory difficulties or written output disorder. So that's an example about why we need to have a better understanding of assessments. So clear information about assessment is required. With regards to the process, there was mention about working groups, and that those working groups will occur from March to June. and that process is going to result in a report to the Ministry of Education. He didn't have any information about what those working groups were going to be, but he did indicate that they were not going to be as extensive as they were. So if you do look in this model, or sorry, in this report that was given to us, and I'm not going to point it out, but they did do a regional visit of school districts and to get feedback last go round, and they said that it was not going to be as thorough as that. I don't know what it's going to be. He was also quite aware that feedback or overly negative feedback could result in that this whole funding model review be dropped entirely and that we just stay with the funding model as is. So, and he made some kind of flippant comments about that. So, I'd make my life easier if we just drop this or that, So, I think that we need to be clear that feedback is important and that we need to support the recommendations that we like and express any concerns that we have. So whatever mechanism there is for that process is yet to be determined. I believe that we have Superintendent Saywell and Secretary Treasurer McVeigh and our chair, Charlene McKay, are all going to be doing, is it this Saturday or Friday? Friday. So an information session. That's going to probably provide us with some information. However, there is a place that individual feedback can be sent to, and that's a website that I'm happy to share out with people. An email that I won't share out now just because it's long and blah. So that was the meeting with the Assistant Deputy Minister. That was a summary of information. He didn't provide us a lot of details to respond to. When PC representatives discussed this, they discussed the most contentious recommendations. Overall, the equity section got by far the most conversation and most reaction. Number one, with regards to equity, a concern is that the plan is to allocate first to high-level special needs and Indigenous education, and then allocate the rest of the money to the rest of the groups. So there was concern expressed of, like, look, we right now are spending approximately 2 times the amount, 2 times on special needs that we are funded. So if we did that, would there be enough money left over? So school districts were really concerned. So what would that actually look like if we started funding in that kind of different order? So that's number one, just the equity in general. Number 6 was probably the one that got the most debate. That's the prevalence model. But again, how are the factors defined? What kind of quality of assessment will remain? When we look at that, 50% of how they're going to determine the prevalence model, who's determining prevalence? Where are they getting their data from? All those questions were discussed. But things like health factors. And that's one question I did ask the Assistant Deputy Minister. What do you mean? What does health factors mean? Give us some definitions on that. So that was one that generated a lot of concern. And the one that generated a lot of concern, and I've already mentioned that I would like to hear from staff on this because I'm a bit surprised. Number 9, whether you fund per number of courses or whether you fund per student. So that is a recommendation that has been made to move from per number of courses to per student. So I don't have an opinion on that because I think I'm not the best person to have a reaction. With regards to accountability section, overall, and I was a bit surprised because to me, when reading the accountability, they seem to be less contentious. There was some concern from some school districts expressed about accountability measures increasing workloads of staff. So what some said was that it should not come at an increased workload for administrative staff. So I think that would be another really important piece of, when you look at these, how does staff feel about those recommendations and feedback? I think a lot of them are fairly straightforward. And financial management section was the one that got the least reaction to it. And a number of them I think that, are really important for us to respond to. I would suggest in a positive way because, for example, number 21, was it 21? Was pointing out that there should be, let me see, what are my notes? Oh, no, that's not it. There was, sorry, that's a different one I'll talk about. But they were talking about ways that capital funding is addressed and that we do definitely need to start, looking at how we fund capital projects or funding in the school districts. And that budgetary concerns it was recognized that since this funding review is not addressing or considering the total amount of money that's been referred to as the quantum of that school districts are getting, the report did indeed recognize that yes, that is a conversation that does need to occur. So I think that since we've all been screaming, that's a conversation that needs to be to occur. We should probably support that. Number 21 was that, and this was a concern, it was about, and it's kind of an ethical one in the sense that when we look at locally generated revenues, some school districts make a fair amount of money from locally generated revenues, but others cannot simply because they don't have the opportunity. So if equity is such a great priority, then how do we address locally generated revenues? They did recommend that you don't touch locally generated revenues, which is very important to some school districts. But for example, if we have school districts way up north that there's no way that they could attract international students or something like that, then that inherently is an inequity. So that was a conversation that occurred as well, just so you're aware. So that's the summary of the meeting. Any questions about the meeting? Okay. So, with regards to next steps, I would, and Stephanie sent in her, I'm not attending tonight, a message about that she was hoping to hear back from staff. And I think that obviously we do need to hear back from staff, and we need to make sure that staff have enough time to formulate their response to these recommendations, which probably is already done, but, to communicate to us so we can be better informed in our response. So we need to make sure that there's enough time allocated for that process. I think Stephanie recommended or hoped that we could do that at the next board meeting, which was next week. Just conveying what was said in her email. I won't even be at that meeting, just so you know, but whenever works. And we also need to, and this was asked as well by the NDTA, we also need to hear from our partner groups. One of the things that the Assistant Deputy Minister communicated in our previous meeting was that it was expected that school districts would connect with their partner groups and incorporate that feedback into their response. That yes, they would be communicating with the kind of provincial level representation, but there was going to also be less connection with the partner groups throughout the secondary consultation process. So it was communicated that at least he suggested that we had a responsibility to reach out to our partner groups, hear their feedback in formulating our responses. So I think that's something that we need to also consider with regards to scheduling. There was, I can talk a little bit more, but fundamentally there was an argument, particularly either with regards to the recommendation or with regards to implementation. BCSDA is continually asked for with regards to our memorandum, a co-governance model, that we receive a period of time to model the draft formula, to consult with our education partners, to give feedback, but fundamentally, back to that, give us more information in advance of implementation so we can be better informed about how to do this and how to aid districts in the implementation during our budgeting process for 2020-2021. There were some questions about how the bargaining process will affect inequities in the collective agreements. So I'm throwing that out there for consideration as well, because of the variety across the province in collective agreements, there's inequities there. And there is some concern about whether the funding formula review plays a role in that. That was also an expressed concern. But that's a summary of the main points. I just think that we need to, moving forward, talk about what steps we need to take in order to provide feedback, and just highlight that it's really important to provide feedback, because if we don't take that opportunity, the feedback that is provided may have significant sway in the outcome of this, and we should at the very least figure out those that we are in favor of. and support those, and then suggest ones that we either will find difficult to implement or concerning for other reasons. And that's it.
All right, thank you. Trustee McKay?
As far as next steps go, my suggestion would be that trustees have had lots of time with this report. We've had it in our hands and possession since December. That trustees flag the recommendations that they have concerns with, and that we formulate our questions for staff to know what those, I guess, worst case scenarios might look like for us, if we feel that it's a concern of that level, or what you're liking and what you're comfortable with, and that any of those questions would be forwarded to, I think we talked about it being myself, to connect with staff on, so that they have an opportunity to report back on the specifics. But I think we should actually have this conversation rather at our next business committee meeting instead of our board meeting, because that also invites our committee members to also funnel those questions through the chair as well. So we'll get questions from any of our stakeholders that have questions pertaining to this report. Okay. And then we can share out what the staff response is to those concerns, and then determine what our feedback mechanism will be directly to the ministry, and also to copying that to the BCSTA.
Right.
Being that the deadline is the end of March for this feedback to come in, we have time to look after that and give it the thought that it requires.
Okay. Trustee Kell?
Thank you. Just a quick question. I think Trustee McKay answered part of it with the deadline. But would it be helpful to have a staff response on the recommendation so we could better understand what staff's perspective is and what they think could be the impact, positive and negative potentially, on our district? I'm just thinking of timelines in terms of if we bring it back to the board, then refer it to staff and come back again, we might not meet that deadline.
Yep. Trustee Barron?
That's not, just to be, I'd like to clarify our response that that's not what I said.
Oh, okay.
No, that's not what I'm saying. But you said that there's a deadline at the end of March?
That's when I'd like a response is that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just thinking that perhaps there might be some value in having a staff response to this report to assist us in our...
The entire report?
To the recommendations.
Yeah, specifically to the recommendations. Now...
That's a pretty heavy request.
It is. So... I have a question. Oh, okay, Chantel, I just Trustee O'Neill, I just want to acknowledge Trustee Barron's question first.
Yes, thank you for the chair. I think I like the suggestions that Trustee McKay is making. A thought that I have, though, in addition to that, is that I think there may be some value of both staff and trustees providing information that they'd like to receive further clarification around simultaneously. My concern is that trustees, for example, if we provided items that we wanted to receive clarification on, and one of those items that we're requesting is missing an item that staff feel should be flagged as a concern, I just would like it to be more of a process, perhaps not so reactionary on behalf of staff. I don't think staff need to go in depth, but I would like to get feedback from staff around anything that they feel may have an impact on our district, negative or positive, to help us through this process, and vice versa.
I agree. Trustee Stanley.
O'Neill's next.
Sorry, Trustee O'Neill, sorry. Trustee O'Neill?
Thank you, and this just may be also a point of clarification. I'm trying to follow along here. So, am I hearing through Chair McKay that we would put our concerns forward as trustees between now and the next business committee meeting to get some feedback or clarification recommendation, and then at the next business committee, we would have a full discussion, including stakeholder groups, citing concerns with recommendations.
Trustee McKay?
Thank you. In response, I would say that those questions should likely be to myself by the next board meeting to allow time for staff to formulate their response. I wouldn't want questions to come in the night before the business committee and then have the staff scrambling to answer that last minute question that comes in. So essentially you'd have a week from now.
Okay, and just if I can add, or put me on the speakers list again.
Is it pertaining to the same thing?
Yes.
Then I'll give you a follow-up.
I think it was Trustee Keller that suggested, if there is existing feedback that staff have on some of these recommendations, then that be shared also in advance of the next board meeting.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Stanley and then Mr. Zare.
So I agree with hearing from staff about any concerns or likes that they have independently of trustee questions. I think that's a good idea. I would also suggest that in addition to hearing from our partner groups at the committee meeting, and especially considering time constraints, I just want to make sure that they have a sufficient opportunity to provide us with their perspective. And so perhaps we could invite our partner groups to, send a submission, write us a letter that was could give them an opportunity to provide detail or at least justification about their concerns. I think that also allows us for better comprehension and digestion of the information instead of just an oral presentation.
I agree with that. And then Mr. Zare, and then I see you, Trustee McKay.
Well, it's always good to have recommendations from a government that says we want to change the funding formula, but we don't want to provide additional funding. So how do we want to move the bricks around so somebody gets more and somebody gets less? The objective, and one of them that they don't want to hear from, is everybody in this province, except maybe two school districts, submitted a needs budget at a point of saying that they needed these services to provide the requirements to make their school districts operate from top to bottom. What they lost and what they needed to provide, and it was already done, costed, and sent to the districts to say, look, you want to bare basics, this is what we need to operate our school district. If you want add-ons, then how are you going to make those happen throughout your years with the growth and other things that come? But here's the bare piece. If you target funding, do you cut in other areas because they didn't fund it? If they do the funding a different way, do you say, okay, well, that area didn't get money because transportation doesn't get enough, you cut a bus route. That's why they put a per pupil funding on it and said, spend it the way you think it needs to try to operate your stuff. That didn't work. So even in these recommendations I read, probably 35 of them, they're all great if you fund accordingly to what you need. Otherwise, they're just lip syncing to people that say, oh, gee, you gave more money for EAs and special needs students and teachers in the special fields, but where did you take it from? Because there wasn't any added in. So when I go down there and somebody says you want to talk about the recommendations, they're all there. But the funding envelope has to go with it. And we're all talking about recommendations. I'm sorry, you're right off the rocker when you're talking about recommendations. Talk about the funding that needs to go within the recommendations. Simple letter to the government. We don't need to know about recommendations on how to fund. We need to know that the money will be there to make these things a reality.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. I'll let Trustee Stanley respond to that.
Yes, I agree. However, I did not mention that, no, the assistant deputy, assistant deputy ADM, made some kinds of comments that it wasn't a guarantee that there wouldn't be more money, because definitely that opinion was voiced. But he did throw that out there. Now, did he make any promises or offer anything concrete? Absolutely not. But he did a couple of times kind of, throw a carrot, if you will, or a little tantalizing statement that there could potentially be more money. So I think that and I didn't see much more money in the budget today, so I'm not seeing it there. But I'm hoping that, and I think this is relevant for our school district, is that when we look at a poverty plan, that we could better fund schools as a way of, kind of a protective factor for students in lower SES backgrounds or additional challenges. So I hear you. I agree that definitely needs to be something that needs to be said, but I think that we need to review these recommendations with a potential that if we could grab more, then let's go for it. Right? I'm not saying we're going to get anything, but he dangled the carrot a couple of times. It was more than once. So
I just want to summarize, make sure I understand what we've agreed to. At the next business committee meeting, we will discuss these recommendations. Prior to that, questions, concerns, comments, the recommendations that are of particular concern to people are to be sent, and questions are to be sent to Trustee McKay, who will work with staff, and staff will make a presentation. Am I following that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And state partner groups are also invited to please send in, and that includes DPAC, that includes our principals and our ENSA, QP, and NDTA, anybody and everyone that we want to get as much a variety of input as possible as to people's responses to these recommendations, so that we can get the most fulsome response that we can when we send ours in. I'm going to speak to you first, and then Trustee McKay.
So through the chair, deadline, you mentioned like a week from today?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now Trustee McKay. And then you, Trustee Barrett.
So, thank you, Chair. The first question would be, or the first comment I have is that I don't necessarily think that we will be reviewing every recommendation.
No.
But only those that are flagged.
Yes, that was my understanding as well.
And I just want to recognize that conversations with stakeholder groups have begun.
Okay, good.
And that I have heard from a couple of stakeholders at this point already.
Excellent. And the
So
reason
those are beginning.
I referenced that was I liked what Trustee Stanley said about having a written record of that. Trustee Barrett?
Through the chair, could we also clarify then that staff will be presenting on not only the items flagged by trustees and stakeholders, but also be providing input based on their perspectives of the recommendations as well?
Yes, I would hope.
Yes.
Yeah. And hopefully integrated into that might also be some kind of report as to the meetings that you're attending on Thursday and Friday this week, so that we have that information as well. And then Trustee Keller.
Just to follow up on Trustee Barron's comment, do we need a formal request for a staff report, or do we just include it in our discussion as a request, if that's something that the board or the committee wants to see?
Good question.
Staff question clarification. When you say you want a staff presentation, do you mean on March 6th?
Yes.
Does that work for you?
Just on the flagged?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, that helped a lot. I'm like, all 22
Point of
recommendations?
clarification, sorry.
Yes.
I think the request was staff comment on each recommendation.
No.
Is that not what you were saying as well?
To clarify, what I was saying was staff to provide input around any recommendations that they feel would have a negative or positive impact. There are some recommendations that I don't feel require any input from staff. So just some information of your perspectives, yeah.
Basically an overview of your perspective, because I imagine you've all read it as well, and you probably have a sense of the ones you really like and really are really concerned
It
about.
might help the committee to know as well that staff do have a meeting booked on February 28th, so the 1 week timeline would work really well for us to dig in and get input from all of our departments. So we have a planning meeting.
Excellent.
Scheduled for the 28th.
Excellent. Yeah. Did you have something else, Trustee Keller?
Sure, sorry, thank you. Just thinking ahead how we might be able to use that input from staff and from questions that arise from the committee and the responses. Would there be any value in providing some recommendations for potential comments that we could chew on at our meetings to help facilitate discussion and help sort of move the process of commenting along?
Can let someone else tackle that, because I don't know. No?
I don't understand your question.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm not sure I'm following you.
So I'm trying to think ahead how the board is going to provide comments on the recommendations. And if staff are going to present a presentation and take a look at the recommendations and flag any red flags and identify any real positives that they see and respond to trustee questions, is there a way that could kind of be tied together with some potential recommendations for comments to the group, the working group, the funding model review?
We don't know who they are.
Okay.
And I think that will hopefully come out of what we get from from staff on at the next business committee meeting. Yeah, I think we'll be able to hopefully we'll come to a consensus on what the key. Yeah, yeah. Trustee.
Just
Sam?
because it wasn't stated explicitly, and Trustee McKay did comment, but it's not just what you're concerned about, it's what you like too, because there's some really great stuff in here.
Yeah.
Right, so.
Okay. Okay. Before I wrap this up, I'll just check, anything else from either our trustees who haven't spoken tonight? Or any of our partners, any comments, or are you comfortable, do you understand what we've put out, what we're asking of you to our partners here? Are you good with that? You don't listen. I'm not even touching it. I'm not even gonna touch that. Yeah.
Unless you say you're Rob.
Mr. Steele, is that gonna be feasible for you to be able to?
Potentially, NSA hasn't, we haven't reviewed these.
Okay. Yeah.
To the chair, I mean, my only concern is Trustee Stanley was at the meetings and districts were saying, we need more information for us to understand these recommendations and provide comment. I'm not gonna go back to all of our moms and dads in the district and ask them to look at this report.
For sure.
And I get there may be some things that really do stand out and I really can comment on. I'm a bit disappointed that at the level of our trustees, province-wide, if they're requesting more information to truly understand these recommendations, it feels like a bit of a make-work project.
Fair enough.
We don't have enough information to truly provide a thoughtful comment.
Yeah, and that's fair.
And that's a reasonable thing to say.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
We'll do the best
I
we
would
can.
encourage you to even say that.
That might be your comment.
Yeah.
That is a complete, yes, that is a completely valid comment. Those are the types of things we want them to know too. Mr. Zver?
And I think I gave you my comment.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tear apart recommendations, because the fact is, there's no funding.
Yeah.
Every recommendation written has no teeth. It's going to cause a problem, because we all do staffing differently. We all have our own different needs of how we look at the district, based on our geographics, based on everything else. All of that's different. Our pay grids are all different, so funding envelope is what? You're gonna say, how much do you get per student? Well, how much do you pay your EAs? How many more EAs can you get if you pay them less? So all of that's a balance that, even teachers' grids. If you're in a higher one or a lower one, new teachers in, it all changes the dynamic. So without a basic model of telling the government, this is what a school district needs to make it work in Prince George, based on what they need, based on what Nanaimo. Recommendations are just another thing that somebody went out and spent a lot of money because the funding formula they put up there didn't work.
Yeah.
And I think the funding formula works with the people that are sitting right there, the secretary treasurers, the finance departments behind us, that have an idea what it costs. And if the districts feel, or if the government feels this district is doing something wrong within the model, then they should speak up and say you're not getting funding for something, and then maybe trustees can then take it on. But without that, we're spinning our wheels. And I'm not gonna waste my time spinning my wheels to bureaucrats that aren't going to pay for it. It's not worth it.
That's also a fair comment, if we can word it in a way that we can integrate it.
You could just say like recommendation 18.
Gotta remember which one that is. Trustee Keller, do you have a comment or question? Okay. Okay, we're gonna say something. Okay. All right. Thank you for that, and thank you for Trustee Stanley for leading us in that conversation. I'm pleased to see that we're moving forward on that because it has been a concern of mine that we do need to be prepared for this. Nothing under for information tonight. Do we have any questions come in? No. All right. Seeing that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn, please. Trustee McKay and Trustee Stanley, all in favor? I believe we're adjourned.